If you stripped away the belts, the millions of dollars, the tigers, and the tattoos, what is left of Mike Tyson? For decades, the world told us the answer. They said he was a monster, a savage, a machine built for destruction who didn't feel pain or remorse. We watched him rise like a hurricane and tear through the heavyweight division, believing that he was something other than human. We treated his life like a spectator sport, cheering for the violence and then cheering for the crash. But the history books often get the protagonist wrong. The story of Mike Tyson isn't about how hard a man can punch. It is about how much a human soul can endure before it shatters completely. It is about a frightened boy from Brooklyn who built a suit of armor so heavy it eventually crushed him. Today, at 59 years old, the armor is gone. The man who once claimed he wanted to rip out his opponent's hearts is now a man tending to pigeons and battling sciatica, facing the one opponent he could never knock out, time itself. From the gutters of Brownsville to the dizzying heights of global fame and down into the darkest cells of prison and grief, this is the autopsy of a legend. This is how the baddest man on the planet had to die so that Mike Tyson could finally live. To understand the rage, you have to touch the fear. Mike Tyson was not born a warrior. He was forged in the fires of neglect. Born in June 1966, he entered a world that didn't seem to want him. His biological father was a ghost, gone before memory could form. His stepfather walked away when Mike was 2. He was left with a mother, Lorna, who was fighting a losing war against poverty and alcohol in the cracked streets of Brownsville, Brooklyn. In the 1970s, Brownsville was less a neighborhood and more a survival experiment. It was a place where sirens were the soundtrack of the night. And in this concrete jungle, Mike was prey. He was a soft, shy boy with a high-pitched lisp and oversized glasses. He was an easy target. He was beaten, robbed, and humiliated so often that he learned to make himself invisible. He later said, "I was afraid of being in the house, and I was afraid of being outside." He found his only sanctuary on the rooftops, high above the violence, among the coops of pigeons. He found creatures that didn't judge him. They were the first things he ever loved. But violence has a way of finding you. The defining moment of his life happened when a neighborhood bully, a teenager much older than him, grabbed Mike's favorite pigeon and snapped its neck in front of him. In that split second, the terrified boy died. A red mist descended. Mike attacked the bully with a frenzy that didn't belong to a child. He beat him until he couldn't stand. It was his first fight, and it taught him a lesson that would rule his life for the next 20 years. In this world, you are either the hammer or the nail. Mike Tyson vowed he would never be the nail again. By age 13, the shy boy was gone. In his place was a juvenile delinquent with nearly 40 arrests on his record. He was a ball of raw, directionless fury heading for a prison cell or a morgue. The system had written him off, but destiny intervened in the form of a detention center called Tryon and a counselor named Bobby Stewart who saw a spark in the chaos. Stewart introduced Mike to the man who would become his savior, his tormentor, and his father, Cus D'Amato. Cus was an eccentric, paranoid boxing genius living in the Catskill Mountains. When he saw 14-year-old Mike spar, he didn't look at his technique, he looked at his spirit. He looked the boy in the eye and said, "You can be the youngest heavyweight champion of the world." For a kid who had never been told he was worth anything, those words were a drug. Mike moved into Cus's home. For the first time, he had a bed, he had food, and he had a light left on for him at night. But Cus demanded a price. Total submission. The training was brutal. 4 a.m. runs in the biting cold. Thousands of sit-ups until his abdominal muscles felt like iron. But the physical training was the easy part. Cus was training Mike's mind. He used fear as a tool, teaching Mike that fear was like fire. Controlled, it warms you. Uncontrolled, it burns you down. He developed the peekaboo style, a defensive technique designed for a shorter fighter to slip inside and detonate bombs. When Mike's mother died when he was 16, the last tether to his past snapped. Cus legally adopted him. They were father and son, united by a singular obsession, domination. In 1985, the monster was unleashed on the professional circuit. It wasn't just that Mike was winning, it was how he was winning. He fought 15 times in his first year. He didn't just knock men out, he broke their will. He walked into the ring without a robe, wearing plain black trunks, no socks, only the sound of impending doom. On November 22nd, 1986, at just 20 years old, he destroyed Trevor Berbick to become the youngest heavyweight champion in history. He had fulfilled the prophecy. He stood at the summit of the world, rich, famous, and feared. But the tragedy was that the one person he wanted to share it with wasn't there. Cus D'Amato had died of pneumonia a year before the championship fight. Mike stood in the ring, holding the belt surrounded by millions of screaming fans, and felt completely alone. Without Cus, the discipline began to rot. He kept winning, of course. He unified the belts. In 1988, he knocked out the undefeated Michael Spinks in 91 seconds. A performance so perfect, so violent, that sports writers compared him to a natural disaster. He was the most famous man on earth. But behind the scenes, the foundation was crumbling. The vultures moved in. Don King, with his electric hair and toxic promises, whispered in Mike's ear. He fired the team Cus had built. He married actress Robin Givens in a whirlwind romance that turned into a public nightmare, playing out on national television like a horror movie. He was a 22-year-old with hundreds of millions of dollars, surrounded by parasites, fueled by trauma, and lacking the one man who could tell him no. Hubris always invites the fall. It arrived in Tokyo, 1990. Mike arrived in Japan, undertrained, partying, and arrogant. Across the ring stood Buster Douglas, a 42-to-1 underdog, dealing with the grief of his own mother's death. The world expected a massacre. Instead, they saw a king lose his crown. The image of Mike Tyson crawling on the canvas, fumbling for his mouthpiece with a swollen eye, shattered the myth of invincibility. From there, the descent was rapid. In 1992, he was convicted of rape and sentenced to 6 years in prison. The heavyweight champion of the world was now inmate number 92235. Prison changed him, but it didn't heal him. It hardened him. He sat in a concrete box, reading philosophy and history, converting to Islam, stewing in his own anger. When he was released in 1995, the world wanted the savage back, and he gave it to them, but the skills were eroding. The discipline was gone. The infamous bite fight against Evander Holyfield in 1997 wasn't a boxing match. It was a panic attack broadcast to the world. It was the act of a man who realized he could no longer win on skill, so he resorted to the streets. By 2003, the unthinkable happened. Mike Tyson, who had earned over $400 million, filed for bankruptcy. The mansions were sold. The tigers were gone. He was millions of dollars in debt, overweight, addicted to cocaine, and looked at as a circus sideshow. The boy from Brownsville had conquered the world, only to lose it all. But rock bottom has a basement. For Mike, that moment wasn't bankruptcy. It wasn't prison. It was May 26th, 2009. Mike received a phone call that no parent should ever receive. His 4-year-old daughter, Exodus, had died in a tragic accident at home. For a man who had built his life on aggression, this was a pain he couldn't punch. It was a grief so total, so absolute, that it incinerated whatever ego he had left. The old Mike Tyson, Iron Mike, the baddest man on the planet, died that day. He later said, "I didn't want to live. I wanted to go with her." But he didn't. Instead, he looked at the wreckage of his life and realized that if he kept going the way he was, he would die. And he would leave his other children with nothing but a legacy of chaos. He married Kiki Spicer, a woman who had stood by him when he had nothing but debts and addiction. With her help, he got sober. He started therapy. He began to unpack the trauma of his childhood, the abuse, the abandonment. He reinvented himself, not as a fighter, but as a storyteller. He took his pain to Broadway, standing alone on stage and telling his truth to the world. He started a podcast, talking to therapists and scientists and athletes about mental health. The world saw a side of him they never knew existed, a man of deep wisdom, sensitivity, and regret. He reclaimed his life, not through violence, but through vulnerability. He built a new fortune, not to buy tigers, but to build a stable home for his children, Milan and Morocco. He became the father he never had. Today, Mike Tyson lives in a sanctuary in Las Vegas. It is a home of peace, filled with the sound of his children playing and the cooing of his pigeons. But the body keeps the score. At 59, the wars he fought are exacting their toll. He battles sciatica that sometimes leaves him unable to walk. In 2024, a severe ulcer flare-up on a plane reminded him of his mortality, leaving him pale and shaking. He speaks openly about death now, not with fear, but with curiosity. He treats his body with the care of a man who knows he is on the final laps of a long race. When he looks in the mirror now, he doesn't see a god of war. He sees a survivor. He sees a man who walked through the fire and managed to carry his soul out the other side. Mike Tyson's story is not a sports story. It is a warning, and it is a beacon. It teaches us that greatness without goodness is a curse. It teaches us that you can have the whole world in your hands and still be empty empty inside. But most importantly, it teaches us that as long as you are breathing, redemption is possible. You can burn your life to the ground and still plant a garden in the ashes. The boy from Brownsville finally found the one thing he was looking for all along. Not a belt, not a check, but peace. If this story moved you, and if you believe in the power of second chances, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We are dedicated to telling the real stories behind the legends. And let us know in the comments, what is the biggest lesson you took from the life of Iron Mike? Thank you for watching.